The story begins on a sweltering afternoon in the heart of the American South, where the plantation stretches endlessly under a haze of heat and humidity. Spanish moss drapes itself over gnarled oaks, moving gently in the wind as if whispering secrets of the past. The gates, once polished iron, now rust and creak with every push of the breeze. It is here, in this juxtaposition of grandeur and decay, that the shadow of cruelty first makes itself known. A lone visitor approaches the estate, drawn by rumors and fragments of old letters that speak of horrors long buried. As they cross the threshold, the air grows heavier, thick with the weight of centuries of suffering. The oppressive heat seems almost to carry with it the screams of those who once toiled under the sun, invisible to the eyes of the world yet impossible to ignore. The skeletal remains discovered in the field, partially hidden by overgrown grass, form an eerie tableau that immediately arrests the visitor's attention. Bones are arranged in a pattern that suggests deliberate placement, not haphazard decay. It is a formation reminiscent of an arena, as if these men, long dead, were spectators in a grotesque theater designed by a single calculating mind. The wind shifts, stirring the moss, and with it comes the faintest echo of struggle, though perhaps it is only imagination, a trick of the mind attempting to fill in the gaps left by centuries of silence. Even so, the imagination does not feel false here. The place carries a weight, a residue of trauma, that makes it impossible to dismiss. Every step taken across the ground seems to echo, not merely in sound, but in the sense of something watching, waiting, the lingering presence of those forced into unimaginable circumstances. The plantation owner, whose reputation precedes him even in hushed whispers, is introduced not through direct description but through the shadows of his actions. Records hint at a man of charm and intellect, able to command respect and fear in equal measure. His charisma masks a ruthless fascination with control and spectacle, the kind that transforms human lives into a form of entertainment. Guests arriving for grand feasts would have seen only the surface, immaculate gardens, polished floors, and an air of refinement. But beneath that veneer, a darker purpose unfolded, hidden from polite society yet known in terrified whispers among the enslaved men. They spoke of secret arenas where life and death danced at the whim of a single individual, a man whose obsession with mastery extended far beyond the ordinary cruelties of the plantation. The narrative emphasizes contrast immediately, contrasting the visual beauty of the estate with the horrors contained within. The sunlit facades of the main house cast long shadows over the quarters where the enslaved lived, a metaphor for the duality of the place, outwardly prosperous, inwardly decaying. This duality is reinforced by the first-person perspective of a fictional chronicler who slowly uncovers fragments of the truth, assembling the story from letters, whispers, and the skeletal evidence scattered across the grounds. The chronicler's fascination mirrors that of the audience, pulling them deeper into a world where moral certainties blur, and human depravity becomes a lens through which the past must be examined. Atmosphere dominates this section. The rustle of leaves, the groan of old timber, the distant cry of birds, all contribute to a sense of tension that never fully dissipates. Each environmental detail is selected to heighten unease, the way shadows pool beneath trees, the uneven earth underfoot, the flicker of light through shuttered windows. Even the air seems to carry history, thick with the sweat and blood of generations, leaving the visitor, and by extension, the audience, with a visceral understanding that this plantation is not merely a setting, but a character itself, imbued with memory and malevolence. The psychological undercurrent is just as important as the physical. There is an almost imperceptible dread that builds gradually, seated in the discovery of the arena and nourished by the knowledge of what it once represented. The enslaved men, their stories long silenced by time and fear, become both victims and narrators, their experiences reconstructed from traces of existence, from injuries noted in scattered records, from the geometry of skeletal remains. Each fragment tells of terror, cunning, and a forced obedience that borders on ritual. Their humanity, stripped in life yet preserved in death, forms a haunting presence that challenges any notion of moral detachment. Suspense is layered carefully through pacing. Moments of observation are intercut with flashbacks, imagined reconstructions of what might have occurred in the hidden arenas. These sequences are deliberately incomplete, never fully revealing the horror, creating a tension that keeps the audience emotionally engaged. The plantation owner's machinations are suggested rather than detailed outright, allowing imagination to fill the void, which often proves more unsettling than any graphic depiction could. By the end of this section, the audience is firmly anchored in the world of the story, a place of grotesque beauty, moral ambiguity, and latent violence. The stage is set for deeper exploration of the plantation's history, the men trapped within its power structures, and the psychological and physical games that define this dark chapter. The arrival of the specter does not merely introduce the story, it immerses the viewer in a slow-burning dread that will carry through every subsequent section, establishing an emotional resonance that lingers long after the first 950 words conclude. The sense of foreboding is unrelenting, leaving viewers with a chilling awareness that what has been uncovered is only the beginning. The skeletal remains, the whispered stories, and the oppressive heat together create a sensory tableau that signals both the enormity of the cruelty to come and the emotional weight that will be carried throughout the narrative. Here, in these first moments, the plantation has already begun to speak, its language one of shadows, silence, and the faint, unending echo of human suffering. The plantation did not exist in isolation, it was part of a vast, interwoven network of wealth, power, and systemic oppression that defined the antebellum South. Rolling fields stretched endlessly, punctuated by the occasional stand of cypress trees and the distant outline of rivers reflecting the sun's glare. The estate itself was a sprawling monument to ambition and exploitation, with brickwork meticulously laid, whitewashed pillars standing as symbols of authority, and the main house looming like a sentinel over the laboring men and women. Yet beneath this facade of grandeur, life was meticulously controlled, every movement observed, every routine dictated. The narrative emphasizes the duality between surface elegance and hidden cruelty, an environment where beauty and terror coexist in uneasy tension. Daily life on the plantation was regimented with military precision. Enslaved men and women rose before dawn, their movements choreographed to the rhythm of labor and surveillance. Cornfields stretched in perfect rows, the soil turned by hands blistered and calloused beyond repair. The overseers, armed with whips and an unyielding authority, patrolled the fields, enforcing compliance and punishing any sign of hesitation. At night, the quarters were small and cramped, filled with the scent of sweat and the muffled whispers of exhaustion. Sleep was brief and uneasy, dreams were haunted by the memory of the overseer's lash and the terrors of the hidden arenas where the plantation owner's cruelest whims played out. These daily routines created a world in which fear and subjugation became as natural as the rising sun, shaping the minds and bodies of those who lived under this oppressive regime. The plantation owner's early life provides context for the cruelty that would define the estate. Born into privilege, he inherited both wealth and the expectation of power. Accounts from family letters, estate records, and contemporary accounts suggest a boy fascinated with dominance and spectacle, who showed early signs of manipulative charm and cunning. He learned to wield authority like a weapon, understanding that fear could be as effective as admiration in securing obedience. Over time, this fascination mutated into obsession, and what began as a desire for control transformed into a systematic orchestration of human suffering disguised as entertainment. The psychological portrait of the man is painted carefully, revealing both brilliance and pathology, and setting the stage for the atrocities to come. Local folklore and oral histories weave through the narrative, providing glimpses into the lives of the enslaved and the cultural backdrop against which these horrors unfolded. Tales of spirits haunting the fields, of murmurs that predicted death, and of songs that carried hidden warnings speak to a community navigating trauma through myth and shared memory. The enslaved men and women developed a sophisticated, coded language of resistance and warning, communicating danger, opportunity, and hope under the oppressive gaze of the overseers. These stories are not mere embellishments, they are historical artifacts, reflecting the mental and emotional frameworks of people forced to live under constant threat. They reveal resilience, ingenuity, and the ways in which culture and spirituality can serve as mechanisms for survival amid unimaginable adversity. The plantation's architecture itself reflects both aspiration and oppression. The main house, with its expansive verandas and tall windows, was designed to impress visitors and project an image of cultivated refinement. In contrast, The slave quarters were low and cramped, constructed with little concern for comfort or safety. The fields, meticulously ordered, symbolized control over the land and the people who labored upon it. Hidden within the landscape were the arenas, sandy pits or walled spaces, often disguised or secluded, where the cruel spectacles were carried out. These arenas were a physical manifestation of the plantation owner's obsession, spaces where human life was reduced to entertainment and experimentation. The narrative contrasts these spaces, showing how physical environments reinforce social hierarchies, perpetuate violence, and shape psychological experiences. Social dynamics on the plantation were complex. Enslaved individuals formed communities within the confines of oppression, creating networks of support, mentorship, and shared knowledge. Older men and women taught the younger generation skills of survival, including ways to avoid punishment, understand the patterns of the overseers, and anticipate danger. At the same time, the presence of internalized fear and suspicion, seeded by constant surveillance and the threat of betrayal, created tension and instability within these communities. The story emphasizes the human cost of systemic cruelty, showing how trauma permeates relationships and reshapes social bonds. This exploration of community and isolation deepens the audience's understanding of life under slavery, providing emotional resonance that grounds the narrative in lived experience rather than abstraction. Economic forces are central to understanding the plantation's function. Wealth derived from cotton and tobacco cultivation depended on the unrelenting labor of enslaved people, whose suffering was commodified and hidden beneath the surface of polite society. The plantation owners' gladiatorial games, horrific as they were extensions of this economic logic, human lives converted into entertainment, wagers, and status. Visitors from neighboring plantations, local elites, and occasional travelers reinforced this system, either through participation, tacit approval, or sheer indifference. The section examines how profit, power, and spectacle intertwined, demonstrating that atrocities were not merely the product of a singular psychopathy, but of a broader societal framework that permitted and even encouraged cruelty. Psychological tension is amplified through subtle detail. The narrative contrasts the day-to-day monotony of plantation labor with the shocking violence of the hidden arenas. Readers are led to consider how normalized brutality can warp perceptions of morality and decency, how fear can shape decision-making, and how the human mind adapts to environments where survival depends on obedience and cunning. The plantation owner's influence extends beyond the arenas into every interaction, shaping thought, behavior, and the fabric of community life. By exploring the mental and emotional landscape of both the oppressed and the oppressors, the story creates a layered, psychologically immersive atmosphere. The audience is gradually introduced to the first signs of the gladiatorial system's encroachment on everyday life. Rumors circulate among the enslaved, and small hints emerge in letters and estate records, men missing without explanation, strange gatherings after dusk, and whispers of contests with fatal stakes. Suspense builds through these early glimpses, framing the plantation not just as a historical setting, but as a character with its own shadowy influence. The narrative emphasizes the creeping awareness of horror, the way dread accumulates incrementally, and the psychological mechanisms by which both fear and fascination take hold. By the end of this section, the audience fully understands the plantation as a world shaped by contrasts, beauty and decay, wealth and suffering, order and terror. The historical context, cultural backdrop, and environmental detail work in tandem to establish a sense of place that is immersive, emotionally charged, and morally complex. Viewers are prepared to follow the story deeper into the shadows, understanding the social, economic, and psychological forces that allowed human cruelty to be systematized and glorified. Every detail reinforces the tension, setting the stage for the coming sections where the gladiatorial games will be revealed in their full, horrifying scope. The first murmurs of something deeply unnatural began quietly, almost imperceptibly, among the enslaved men who labored from dawn to dusk. The fields were a theater of endurance and suffering, yet beneath the sun's relentless glare, a darker story unfolded. In the quarters, amid the cramped wooden huts and the thin smell of smoke and sweat, men exchanged fragmented accounts of disappearances and unexplainable deaths. Each story was a whisper, shared cautiously to avoid the ears of overseers or the master himself. These whispered conversations carried an eerie weight, for they were not mere tales of punishment or labor, but of something meticulously orchestrated, ritualized, almost ceremonial, and lethal. Suspense builds here through a layering of secrecy, as the audience begins to sense that these murmurs are the first signs of a much larger, hidden system of cruelty. The enslaved men referred to these disappearances with coded language. Words that might seem innocuous to outsiders were laden with meaning, signaling danger, opportunity, or the presence of the master's cruel spectacles. Songs sung in the evenings held hidden warnings, certain lines repeated in hushed tones carried threats disguised as folklore. Oral histories, passed down quietly from older men to the younger, contained fragments of what would later be known as the gladiatorial contests. The narrative emphasizes the ingenuity and resilience of these communities, whose survival depended on interpreting signs, reading the behaviors of the overseers, and navigating the psychological landscape of fear. Every whisper carried both information and hope, a delicate balancing act between despair and the desire to endure. These early signs were often dismissed by outsiders, but for those who lived on the plantation, the implications were undeniable. Missing men were replaced with silence, their absence marked by the sudden reallocation of labor or the hush that fell across the quarters when a group gathered in secret. The narrative draws attention to the meticulous observation required to notice such patterns, highlighting the mental acuity and courage of the enslaved men who pieced together fragments of truth while evading detection. The audience begins to understand the dual reality of the plantation, a world of rigid routine and brutal oversight, layered over a shadow realm where terror and strategy intertwined. The narrative also introduces the first direct encounters with the arena's effects. Some men returned from the contests, physically scarred and psychologically altered. Their gazes carried a haunted intensity, their movements cautious, deliberate, almost as if anticipating unseen threats. These survivors rarely spoke of what occurred within the arena, yet their presence was testimony enough. The chronicler reconstructs their experiences through observation and inference, describing injuries, behavioral changes, and subtle signs of trauma that hint at the brutality endured. These accounts deepen suspense while maintaining historical realism, emphasizing that horror in this context is psychological as much as physical. Rumors of the gladiatorial contests began to infiltrate the wider plantation community, though always carefully veiled. Certain overseers and house staff were aware of the spectacles, their complicity either born of fear or fascination. They carried fragments of knowledge back to the quarters in indirect ways, creating a network of partial truths that fueled imagination, dread, and anticipation. These stories also highlight the layered nature of fear. Knowledge of the contests was as dangerous as ignorance, and the enslaved had to navigate both with extreme caution. The narrative draws attention to the subtleties of power, showing how the plantation owners' influence extended far beyond direct action into the mental and emotional lives of all who dwelled there. The psychological toll of these whispers is explored in depth. Men lived in a constant state of tension, their minds attuned to sudden changes in sound or behavior. Sleep was disrupted by nightmares, sometimes recalling the arena, sometimes imagined but no less terrifying. Social bonds were strained, for trust could be deadly, an overheard word or a misplaced gesture could result in punishment or death. Yet within this tension also lay solidarity. Secret communications, coded messages, and the shared understanding of imminent danger created a fragile, resilient community. The audience witnesses both the fragility and strength of human connection under conditions of extreme oppression, establishing an emotional resonance that sustains suspense while highlighting humanity's capacity for endurance. Subtle Gothic imagery is employed to intensify the mood. Shadows cling to the corners of the huts, the wind whistles through the eaves, and the flickering light of oil lamps casts ominous, shifting patterns across walls. These atmospheric details reinforce the psychological state of those living under constant threat, immersing the audience in a sensory experience of dread. The quarters themselves become characters in the narrative, spaces where fear and hope coexist, where whispered truths pass through generations, and where the first threads of rebellion and resistance begin to emerge. The narrative traces the escalation of unease as rumors solidify into grim expectation. Men began to anticipate the arrival of the Masters' Games, mentally preparing for contests they could neither refuse nor fully comprehend. The tension is slow burning, a reflection of both the meticulous planning by the plantation owner and the human capacity to sense impending danger. The audience is guided through these psychological landscapes, understanding not only the mechanics of the gladiatorial contests but also the broader climate of oppression and terror that made such atrocities possible. This section also foreshadows the moral complexity of the story. The audience is introduced to the idea that complicity, coercion, and survival exist in a delicate, morally ambiguous balance. Enslaved men are both victims and participants in a world engineered for cruelty. Overseers may be reluctant enforcers or silent witnesses. The first true glimpse of the plantation owner's brutality comes into focus with the accounts of the earliest gladiatorial contests, events meticulously designed and executed to entertain and terrify in equal measure. The arena itself, often hidden behind the dense undergrowth of the plantation or constructed within abandoned buildings, is described with a clinical precision that heightens the tension. Sanded floors, makeshift barriers, and rudimentary platforms suggest a careful orchestration, a deliberate effort to transform the suffering of men into a spectacle. The narrative reconstructs these events through scattered testimony, fragments of letters, and the skeletal evidence uncovered decades later, creating a haunting sense of realism without resorting to sensationalism. The audience is invited to witness, through description and implication, the calculated cruelty of the plantation owner. The men forced to fight were drawn from those who had already endured unimaginable hardship in the fields. Their physical conditioning, honed by long hours of labor, made them suited to the contests, yet their preparation was irrelevant against the moral depravity guiding the matches. Each bout was meticulously arranged to maximize tension and manipulate fear, pitting individuals against one another in life-or-death confrontations. The narrative emphasizes the psychological terror alongside the physical danger, highlighting the intricate control exerted by the plantation owner. These contests were not spontaneous or chaotic, they were engineered performances, blending strategy, coercion, and sadistic curiosity. The audience is made to understand that what is being described is both historical and horrifying, a testament to the extremes of human cruelty. Witness accounts, where available, paint a vivid yet restrained picture. Overseers noted the reactions of the men, the stoicism of some, the visible tremor in others, the subtle glances that conveyed recognition of imminent death. Survivors, when they could be questioned decades later, spoke in fragmented phrases, their memories punctuated by silence. Diaries, letters, and secondary sources are woven into the narrative to reconstruct the events with careful fidelity, creating layers of perspective that illuminate both the spectacle and its psychological impact. The audience gains insight into the dread and anticipation that suffused each contest, understanding that terror itself was as much a weapon as any physical implement. The arena becomes a microcosm of the plantation's broader system of control. The rules are arbitrary, yet rigidly enforced, alliances and enmities form and dissolve under the master's gaze. Every gesture, every hesitation, is noted and potentially punished. The narrative contrasts these moments with scenes of the plantation's daily operations, emphasizing the pervasive reach of fear and the omnipresence of authority. Men carry the weight of expectation, terror, and survival instincts with them from the fields into the arena, a seamless transition that underscores the inescapable nature of their oppression. The audience is encouraged to perceive the interconnectedness of labor, spectacle, and control, seeing the gladiatorial games as an extension of the plantation's social hierarchy. The psychological dimension of the first contests is central. Men experience terror, despair, and, in some cases, fleeting flashes of defiance. The narrative explores how the anticipation of combat shapes thought and behavior, the hyper-awareness of surroundings, the mental calculation of opponents' weaknesses, and the numbing of empathy required to endure the ordeal. The plantation owner observes with a clinical fascination, noting not just the outcomes of the fights but the subtle reactions of participants under duress. These observations inform future contests, creating a feedback loop in which cruelty and spectacle are refined and amplified. The audience is drawn into this dynamic, understanding the interplay of power, fear, and manipulation without needing explicit graphic imagery. The section also addresses the complicity and silence of bystanders. Some overseers and household staff are unwilling participants, coerced into facilitating the contests or maintaining secrecy. Others are active witnesses, their fascination or indifference reinforcing the plantation owner's authority. These dynamics illustrate the moral complexity of the environment, showing that atrocities do not occur in isolation but are sustained through networks of tacit approval, fear, and social pressure. The audience is invited to reflect on human behavior under conditions of systemic oppression, considering both individual agency and structural constraints. Interwoven with these reconstructions are subtle flashes of the men's humanity and resilience. Despite the terror, they form small alliances, share whispered strategies, and demonstrate extraordinary endurance. Moments of quiet solidarity, glances exchanged, and fleeting acts of courage are highlighted, reminding the audience that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity and intelligence persist. These glimpses of resistance heighten the emotional stakes, ensuring that the narrative balances horror with the profound reality of human strength under duress. The environmental details enhance the cinematic quality of the section. Dust swirls in sunlit shafts penetrating the arena's partially open roof, shadows stretch across sand and makeshift barriers, and the distant hum of the plantation creates a continuous undertone of oppression. Every element is selected to immerse the audience in the tension, ensuring that the scene is felt as much as understood. The narrative uses these sensory cues to reinforce suspense, evoke empathy, and maintain a consistent, slow-burning dread. By the end of this section, the audience comprehends the full weight of the plantation owner's cruelty as it transitions from rumor and whisper to tangible action. The first blood has been drawn, establishing the stakes, the psychological terror, and the moral complexity that will define subsequent contests. Suspense is heightened through careful pacing and detailed reconstruction, and the audience is left with an emotional understanding of both the horrors endured and the resilience required to survive them. The stage is set for further escalation, with the gladiatorial system poised to dominate the lives of the enslaved men and the narrative deepening into the interplay of fear, spectacle, and human endurance. The plantation's public face was one of cultivated elegance and genteel prosperity, masking the horrors that lurked beneath its surface. Guests arrived on horseback or in carriages, greeted by manicured gardens, the scent of fresh flowers, and the polished grandeur of the main house. Music floated from the parlors, fine china clinked on tables, and laughter filled the hallways, creating an impression of civility and refinement. Yet beyond these carefully staged displays, the estate concealed a hidden world of cruelty, one in which men's lives were reduced to instruments of spectacle. This stark contrast between appearance and reality forms the emotional core of the section, emphasizing the insidious nature of evil when cloaked in charm and propriety. Religious leaders and local elites played a complex role in maintaining this facade. Some were genuinely oblivious, their visits limited to the grandeur of the house and the meticulously curated events presented to them. Others were aware of whispers or rumors but chose denial or rationalization, framing the atrocities as divine judgment, moral lessons, or unavoidable consequences of a hierarchical society. Letters and sermons from the period reveal a society struggling to reconcile wealth and piety with the undeniable presence of cruelty. This denial, whether motivated by fear, self-interest, or cognitive dissonance, allowed the plantation owners' brutal games to continue without public scrutiny. The narrative explores these dynamics, demonstrating how societal complicity can perpetuate atrocity. Within the household, servants and staff acted as intermediaries between the visible world of refinement and the hidden arena of suffering. They witnessed the master's machinations, sometimes assisting under coercion, sometimes turning blind eyes out of fear or self-preservation. Their dual roles illustrate the layered complexity of power and complicity. Each individual negotiates moral boundaries, balancing survival against conscience. The audience is guided through this tension, understanding that moral decisions under extreme oppression are rarely straightforward. These dynamics reinforce the section's central theme: horror often thrives behind the polished masks of civility. The enslaved community, meanwhile, remained acutely aware of the contrast between outward appearances and hidden realities. Men returned from the arena carrying invisible scars, their bodies marked by the brutality they had endured. Conversations within the quarters reflect a constant negotiation between caution and the need to share information. Whispers describe the tactics of the master, the shifting rules of the games, and the delicate balance required to survive both field labor and the deadly spectacle. Suspense is maintained through these narrative threads, as the audience recognizes that knowledge of the contests is both a source of empowerment and a potential trigger for punishment. A sense of psychological tension permeates the section. The plantation owner's careful curation of public image and private cruelty creates a pervasive atmosphere of uncertainty and dread. The enslaved live in a world where outward normalcy conceals imminent danger, and where even moments of respite are tinged with the knowledge of what lies behind the facade. This tension is accentuated by environmental detail, the flicker of lamplight in the halls, the muffled echo of voices through the corridors, the sudden silence that falls over the estate when the master's gaze shifts. The audience experiences these sensory cues as extensions of the psychological landscape, reinforcing immersion in the narrative. The section also examines the role of fear in shaping behavior. Overseers enforce the master's will not merely through physical punishment but through the subtle threat of exposure, disgrace, and unpredictability. Men learn to navigate the nuances of power, reading gestures, tone, and circumstance to anticipate consequences. Even the leisure and ceremony of the public world are manipulated, serving as reminders of authority and reinforcing the master's omnipresence. Suspense arises from the audience's awareness that danger is not confined to the arena, it permeates every interaction, every step taken across the estate. Subtle instances of rebellion and resistance emerge, highlighting the resilience of the human spirit amid systematic oppression. Small acts of defiance, shared knowledge, coded signals, refusal to participate in certain tasks, serve as counterpoints to the pervasive fear. These moments are fleeting, often dangerous, but they illuminate the psychological complexity of the enslaved, who negotiate survival and agency under extreme conditions. By emphasizing these acts, the narrative ensures that the audience perceives the enslaved men not solely as victims but as intelligent, adaptive individuals exercising strategy and moral judgment in impossible circumstances. The audience also witnesses the calculated cruelty of the plantation owner in action. He manipulates the public and private spheres with precision, ensuring that his guests remain oblivious while his spectacles continue. The interplay of control, performance, and moral corruption is explored in detail, emphasizing the extent to which his power is psychological as well as physical. The narrative draws attention to the layers of manipulation, showing that terror is most effective when hidden beneath the veneer of respectability. This duality deepens suspense, as viewers understand the stakes for those who inhabit the estate while simultaneously observing the sophistication of the master's control. Cultural and social context is woven throughout. The plantation owner's ability to maintain a facade of civility depends on broader societal structures that condone inequality, ignore rumor, and elevate wealth above morality. The narrative situates the story within this historical framework, illustrating how systemic oppression enables individual cruelty. At the same time, the audience is reminded that human resilience and ingenuity persist even under these conditions, creating a tension that drives emotional engagement. The contrast between public masks and private horrors becomes a lens through which viewers can explore both historical and psychological truths. By the end of this section, the audience is fully aware of the duality that defines the plantation, a place of outward elegance and hidden terror, where fear, complicity, and survival intersect. The narrative sets the stage for the escalation of the gladiatorial games, emphasizing that the horrors are not confined to isolated events but are embedded within the social, psychological, and cultural fabric of the estate. Suspense, moral complexity, and emotional resonance are maintained, preparing viewers for the next stage of the story, where the arena itself comes into sharper focus and the stakes for all involved continue to rise. The gladiatorial games were the apex of the plantation owner's cruelty, spaces where fear, strategy, and human endurance collided under his meticulous orchestration. These arenas, often concealed within the estate's peripheries, were constructed to enforce both spectacle and terror. Sanded floors, improvised barriers, and crude seating for the overseers and select guests transformed them into stages of calculated violence. The narrative reconstructs these events with precise attention to environmental detail, dust rising in shafts of light, shadows stretching across the sand, and the distant murmur of the plantation blending with the tense silence of the arena. Every element is chosen to immerse the audience in the psychological as well as physical dimensions of the contests, creating a slow-burning dread that mirrors the experiences of those forced to participate. The participants were drawn exclusively from the enslaved men who had already endured years of grueling labor and deprivation. Their bodies were conditioned for endurance and survival, yet these skills were tested against both arbitrary cruelty and the unpredictable dynamics of combat. Each contest was carefully planned to maximize suspense, fear, and spectacle, often forcing men to fight friends, neighbors, or even brothers. The narrative emphasizes the psychological torment alongside the physical demands, portraying the arena as a microcosm of the plantation itself, a place where obedience was enforced, resistance punished, and human life became a commodity for amusement and power. The audience is invited to grasp the interplay of fear, strategy, and social hierarchy that defined every encounter. Spectators within the plantation, ranging from overseers to occasional visitors, were both observers and participants in the theater of cruelty. Their reactions, whether fascination, revulsion, or silent complicity, contributed to the psychological pressure exerted on the combatants. The plantation owner manipulated these dynamics, rewarding perceived bravery, punishing hesitation, and using the gaze of the audience to amplify terror. In this way, every gesture, glance, and reaction became part of a broader system of control. The narrative underscores that the arena was not merely a physical space but a psychological instrument, where the fears of both participants and observers were meticulously calibrated to reinforce dominance. The combatants, despite the overwhelming terror, displayed remarkable resilience. Some relied on alliances, whispered strategies, and subtle communication to navigate the deadly contests. Moments of fleeting solidarity emerged amid the brutality. A glance, a coded signal, or a deliberate hesitation could mean survival or death. These acts of resistance are highlighted not only to humanize the enslaved men but also to maintain narrative tension, showing that even within the most oppressive circumstances, intelligence, courage, and ingenuity persist. The audience experiences both dread and admiration, understanding that endurance in the arena was as much mental as it was physical. The narrative delves into the psychological machinery of the plantation owner, whose fascination with control and spectacle reached its zenith in the arena. He observed patterns of fear and resilience, adjusting the contests to amplify suspense and maintain absolute dominance. Men were manipulated not only through physical threat but through uncertainty and anticipation, a form of psychological orchestration that made even moments of relative calm laden with tension. The audience gains insight into the calculated sadism of the master, understanding that his cruelty was not impulsive but methodical, a dark extension of his obsession with power and entertainment. Environmental and sensory details are central to immersing the audience. The smell of dust and sweat, the echo of strained breaths, the muted thud of blows on sanded floors, and the flicker of torchlight create a cinematic texture that enhances suspense. Shadows stretch unnaturally, obscuring movements and heightening the fear of the unknown. Sounds, from the quiet shuffle of feet to the distant calls of overseers, punctuate moments of tension, ensuring that the audience experiences the arena as a lived environment rather than a conceptual abstraction. These details also reinforce the emotional weight, emphasizing the vulnerability and terror of the combatants. The section also explores the broader implications of the arena as a reflection of systemic oppression. The contests mirror the plantation's hierarchical structure, where obedience, violence, and spectacle coexist to maintain control. The psychological strategies employed within the arena, fear, uncertainty, observation, extend beyond the contests themselves, shaping behavior in the fields, the quarters, and the household. The audience is encouraged to see the arena not as an isolated atrocity but as a microcosm of the mechanisms by which power, terror, and complicity interact. Subtle moments of humanity punctuate the narrative. Despite the omnipresent threat of death, men form brief alliances, display empathy, and exercise cunning to survive. These acts are often dangerous, fleeting, and understated, yet they illuminate the capacity for moral judgment and resilience even under extreme duress. The narrative balances horror with these glimpses of courage, ensuring that the story maintains emotional depth alongside suspense. The audience witnesses the duality of the arena, a place of terror and death, but also one where human ingenuity and solidarity emerge in small, vital gestures. Complicity and moral ambiguity are emphasized throughout. Overseers and staff, some coerced, some indifferent, and some complicit, navigate their roles within this system. Their presence underscores the moral complexity of the environment, illustrating how atrocities are sustained through networks of tacit approval and self-preservation. The audience is left to consider the ethical tensions, understanding that horror thrives not only through overt acts but also through silence, indifference, and participation in oppressive systems. These themes reinforce the slow-building dread, emphasizing that the stakes extend beyond the arena to the broader moral landscape of the plantation. By the end of this section, the audience fully comprehends the arena as the apex of the plantation owner's cruelty and ingenuity. It is a space where fear, control, and spectacle converge, reflecting the broader system of oppression that defines the estate. Suspense is maintained through meticulous reconstruction, psychological insight, and cinematic detail, immersing the audience in the physical and emotional dimensions of the contests. The arena becomes both literal and symbolic, a dark mirror of the plantation itself, where human resilience, terror, and moral complexity coexist in a tense, haunting tableau. This section prepares viewers for the next phase of the story, where science, superstition, and subtle resistance begin to emerge amid the shadows, setting the stage for the psychological and societal consequences of the gladiatorial system. This section delves deeply into the external investigations and the growing tension between truth-seeking outsiders and the tightly controlled world of the plantation. Traveling journalists, abolitionists, and medical practitioners, some motivated by moral outrage, others by curiosity, begin to arrive at the fringes of the plantation's influence. Their initial observations are subtle, noticing unusually strong men among the enslaved, scars that do not align with typical labor injuries, and whispered rumors that hint at something far darker than ordinary cruelty. These investigators attempt to gather evidence through interviews, discreet note-taking, and observations of the plantation's daily operations. The narrative explores their growing frustration as every step toward clarity is met with obstruction. Overseers, loyal to the plantation owner either out of fear or self-interest, provide misleading accounts, hide key individuals, or offer contradictory statements. Official documents are missing, altered, or carefully curated to present a veneer of normalcy, leaving the investigators with fragments and half-truths. Even local townspeople, many of whom have seen or heard of the atrocities, hesitate to speak, fearing reprisals or social ostracism. This creates an oppressive atmosphere where the boundary between reality and rumor is blurred. Several dramatic encounters are highlighted, including clandestine visits to the plantation at night to catch glimpses of activity within the hidden arena. Investigators recount hearing screams or seeing shadows moving through torches' flickering light, only to have these accounts dismissed publicly as hallucinations or exaggerations. The section emphasizes how the plantation owner wields both psychological manipulation and financial power to thwart attempts at exposure. His charm masks a calculating intelligence, ensuring that he maintains control over perception, creating a labyrinth of obfuscation that discourages further inquiry. The section also examines the human cost of these investigations. Investigators face growing paranoia, fearing for their own safety, and struggle with the moral dilemma of whether to continue probing at the risk of their lives. Some begin to suspect complicity among the authorities themselves, as bribes and threats extend beyond the plantation into the county's official structures. Letters sent to newspapers are intercepted or altered, and any attempt to rally public attention is met with swift discrediting campaigns. The narrative uses these obstacles to heighten suspense, illustrating the contrast between reason and the plantation owner's orchestrated chaos. Psychologically, this section dives into the tension between belief and denial. Investigators grapple with the horrifying possibility that what they suspect is true, yet they lack concrete evidence to prove it. This liminal space, between suspicion and confirmation, creates emotional strain, uncertainty, and a creeping sense of dread. They witness the psychological resilience and subtle defiance of some enslaved individuals, yet these moments of resistance are fleeting and overshadowed by the ever-present threat of the arena. The section continues by examining the attempts of medical practitioners to explain the physical conditioning and injuries they observe. They note unusual muscle development, healed fractures, and patterns of scars inconsistent with normal plantation labor. They theorize about force training, specialized diets, and the psychological conditioning required to survive repeated duels. Despite their findings, these professional observations cannot break through the plantation owner's meticulously constructed secrecy. Each new discovery adds layers of tension, revealing a cruel system operating with clinical precision beneath the surface of an ostensibly normal plantation. Finally, this section highlights the narrative consequence of these failed investigations. The story emphasizes the emotional and psychological exhaustion of those who attempt to reason with or expose the plantation owner. Their failure is not for lack of skill or persistence but because they are contending with a man who has weaponized secrecy, intimidation, and manipulation. The emotional weight of this realization underscores the broader theme of the documentary: sometimes rational inquiry meets the impenetrable fortress of human cruelty. The audience is left with a lingering unease, understanding that the machinery of oppression on the plantation was so complete that even truth-seekers were powerless to stop it. By the end of this section, the groundwork is laid for the subsequent descent into unmitigated madness, showing how the plantation owner's control over perception and narrative shields his actions from accountability, while also amplifying the horror of what is occurring within the hidden arena. The tension escalates from suspicion to near certainty, setting the stage for the impending chaos that will eventually expose the full depth of his depravity. This section explores the plantation owner's gradual psychological unraveling as his obsession with creating the perfect fighter grows uncontrollable, transforming both the plantation and the lives of those enslaved into instruments of terror. Early on, his actions had a methodical, almost experimental precision. Injuries were recorded, matches were arranged with careful attention to balance and spectacle, and the fighter's skills were analyzed to optimize the violence he orchestrated. But over time, this meticulous system gives way to erratic behavior, impulsive cruelty, and a deepening detachment from reality. His obsession shifts from structured blood sport to an insatiable hunger for domination, control, and psychological torment, making the environment increasingly unpredictable and lethal. The narrative details the ways in which his delusions manifest. Rules for the fights change daily, often arbitrarily, and punishments escalate for minor infractions. Enslaved men are now forced into matches under extreme duress, sometimes deprived of food, water, or sleep, creating fighters who are simultaneously physically conditioned and psychologically broken. The arena, once a concealed tool of measured terror, becomes a nightmarish theater of improvisation, with the plantation owner dictating cruelty based on whims, moods, and obscure obsessions. The enslaved, sensing the unpredictability of his actions, live in a constant state of fear, aware that survival is never guaranteed and that human life is expendable for the sake of his spectacle. The section examines the reactions of those around him. Overseers who once followed instructions out of loyalty or fear now begin to hesitate, some fleeing the plantation altogether or suffering breakdowns under the weight of complicity. Those who remain witness an increase in violent outbursts, often without warning, which ripple through the enslaved community as terror and despair. Local townspeople who have been aware of whispers about the arena report hearing screams at night, seeing torches flicker in abandoned fields, or glimpsing shadowed figures. These accounts amplify the aura of dread surrounding the plantation and establish the psychological stakes of the narrative. Attention is given to the psychological transformation of the enslaved fighters themselves. Men who initially resisted or rebelled are forced into obedience, while others develop coping mechanisms that border on dissociation. The section emphasizes how trauma and fear are weaponized. Fighters learn to anticipate the owner's moods, understand subtle gestures that dictate life or death, and suppress their humanity to survive. Each duel is not only a test of physical endurance but a manifestation of the psychological control exerted by the plantation owner, whose mind is now consumed by a need for domination over both body and spirit. The narrative also explores the escalation of cruelty through increasingly elaborate and sadistic methods. Injuries are no longer just incidental but part of a meticulous display. Matches are arranged to maximize spectacle, psychological torment is embedded into the preparation, and punishments are intentionally cruel to cultivate submission and fear. The plantation owner's notebooks, previously structured and clinical, now contain chaotic observations, obsessive notes about individual fighters, and delusional assessments of human worth. This descent into madness is depicted as both personal and systemic, illustrating how one individual's obsession corrupts an entire microcosm of human life. Parallel to this, the section examines the growing isolation of the plantation itself. Crops fail under neglect, buildings begin to deteriorate, and the surrounding wilderness encroaches as if nature itself recoils from the violence within. Servants and overseers attempt to rationalize their environment, but the air of fear makes objective assessment impossible. The plantation becomes a psychological labyrinth, corridors echo with faint screams, the arena is a constant reminder of impending danger, and even daily routines are overshadowed by dread. The cinematic tone emphasizes sensory detail, immersing the audience in an oppressive atmosphere that mirrors the mental collapse of the plantation owner. Turning points in this descent include disappearances of enslaved men who fail to survive repeated duels, mysterious injuries among overseers, and the emergence of unpredictable patterns of violence that no longer serve strategic purpose. The owner's obsession with creating a legacy through his fighters takes on a grotesque edge. He stages increasingly dangerous matches, sometimes involving multiple men at once, for his own amusement or to satisfy select, complicit spectators. Witnesses, where they exist, describe a man consumed by obsession, unable to empathize, and increasingly detached from reality. This section also explores the psychological consequences for the observers, both internal and external. The enslaved community, forced into silence and submission, internalizes trauma that will reverberate for generations. Outsiders attempting to uncover the truth feel mounting fear, helplessness, and moral outrage, yet they are continually thwarted by secrecy, intimidation, and the plantation owner's charisma. The narrative tension builds as it becomes clear that the violence and cruelty have become self-perpetuating, extending beyond any rational limits. As the section progresses toward its climax, the plantation owner's mania reaches its most dangerous point. He becomes reckless, blending his experimental cruelty with impulsive acts of terror, introducing random challenges, and punishing those who question him with lethal severity. The boundaries between spectator and victim, rationality and madness, are obliterated. The plantation itself is a reflection of his deteriorating mind. Once orderly fields and structures collapse into chaos, creating an environment where survival is dictated by fear, cunning, and endurance. The section closes by foreshadowing the impending disaster. The escalation of cruelty and chaos sets the stage for a catastrophic event, whether through rebellion, accident, or the owner's own hubris. The narrative leaves the audience with a heightened sense of dread, emphasizing that the descent into madness is complete and the plantation, now fully dominated by terror, teeters on the edge of irreversible catastrophe. The emotional resonance is dark and oppressive, solidifying the transformation of the plantation from a controlled environment of terror into a chaotic, nearly apocalyptic theater of human suffering. This section recounts the catastrophic event that marks the collapse of the plantation owner's control and the ultimate exposure of the horrors he had cultivated. The narrative begins by building a tense, slow-burning atmosphere, a night unlike any other, heavy with heat, the smell of smoke in the distance, and the unnerving tension of the enslaved men who anticipate something beyond their daily torment. The plantation, already unstable from neglect and chaos, feels like a pressure cooker, with the owner's escalating mania pushing the entire system toward breaking point. The story describes how the disaster unfolds, though eyewitness accounts vary and remain fragmented, adding to the mystery. Some describe a sudden act of arson, perhaps an act of desperate rebellion by a fighter or a group of enslaved men pushed beyond endurance. Others suggest accidental causes, a lantern tipped over in the hidden arena, a spark from the blacksmithing forge, or structural failures exacerbated by years of neglect. Regardless of origin, the fire spreads with terrifying speed, engulfing barns, stables, and the clandestine arena, turning familiar spaces of torment into infernos of chaos. Attention is given to the human experience during the fire. The enslaved men, caught between survival instincts and forced obedience, are forced to navigate collapsing structures and suffocating smoke. Many struggle to escape while others attempt to save those trapped in the arena or adjacent buildings, highlighting moments of bravery and desperation. The plantation owner, previously meticulous and controlled, is portrayed as unhinged, panicked, and increasingly irrational as he attempts to assert dominance over the flames. His usual authority dissolves in the face of uncontrollable destruction, revealing the limits of his power and the full consequences of his mania. The narrative emphasizes cinematic tension through sensory detail, the crackle of timber, the roar of fire, the screams of combatants caught between survival and spectacle, and the acrid stench of burning that fills the night air. The fire itself becomes almost a character, an unpredictable force that mirrors the chaos of the owner's psyche. As the blaze spreads, it consumes both the physical structures and the carefully constructed system of cruelty, leaving nothing intact but the scorched land and fragmented memories of the enslaved. The section also explores the uncertainty surrounding the plantation owner's fate. Some accounts suggest he perished in the flames, trapped in the arena he had once controlled with obsessive precision. Others propose he was killed by one of his own fighters or escaped into the wilderness, leaving a trail of rumor and speculation. This ambiguity reinforces the eerie tone of the documentary, leaving both the characters within the story and the audience in a state of unresolved tension. The narrative underscores the idea that the collapse was not just physical but symbolic, the destruction of a system built on violence, domination, and psychological terror. In the aftermath, the section portrays the immediate human consequences. Survivors scatter into the surrounding forests, carrying not only their physical wounds but deep psychological trauma. Some flee into anonymity, while others eventually return to nearby towns, bearing harrowing testimony of the atrocities and the inferno that consumed the plantation. The community that had long turned a blind eye is confronted with undeniable evidence of the horrors that were whispered about for decades. The narrative conveys the emotional weight of this confrontation, highlighting both relief and lingering fear. The role of witnesses is emphasized to heighten narrative suspense. Those who survived provide fragmented recollections, often contradicting one another, creating a patchwork of truth and speculation. The uncertainty of these accounts adds depth to the mystery, illustrating how trauma can distort memory and how fear can silence full disclosure. Scholars, local residents, and later historians piece together these accounts, yet the exact sequence of events remains elusive, leaving an unsettling gap between what is known and what remains hidden. The story delves into the symbolic implications of the fire as well. It represents both an end and a beginning, the obliteration of the owner's power and the opening for historical reckoning. The arena, the instruments of torture, and the architectural spaces designed for cruelty are all reduced to ash, yet the legacy of what occurred endures in human memory and folklore. The section examines the psychological resonance of this destruction, suggesting that the horror of the plantation was so extreme that it could not survive intact, either physically or metaphorically, without imploding. Finally, this section transitions toward reflection and aftermath. The destruction leaves a void, both tangible and moral, challenging the community to confront its complicity and the limits of justice. It sets the stage for the subsequent sections exploring the official response, societal denial, and the long-lasting shadow of trauma. The narrative closes on a haunting note: even though the fire destroyed the physical space of cruelty, it cannot erase the memories of those who survived, nor the dark mark left on the land itself. The night of fire thus becomes both a literal and figurative climax, delivering cathartic release while leaving unresolved questions that continue to haunt the story. This section examines the immediate response of authorities and the broader societal mechanisms that shaped the narrative after the catastrophic fire consumed the plantation. It opens with the arrival of local officials, magistrates, and investigators, who find the plantation in ruins, smoldering under the early morning sun. The scene is chaotic: charred timber, twisted iron, scorched earth, and remnants of the hidden arena litter the property. Bodies are missing, partially burned, or unrecognizable, making any reconstruction of events difficult. The officials are confronted not only with physical destruction but with the fragments of horror left in the survivors' testimonies. Despite the apparent evidence of extreme violence and forced combat, the narrative emphasizes the immediate impulse to control the story. Authorities quickly frame the disaster as a tragic accident, perhaps negligence in handling lanterns or fires near barns, avoiding any acknowledgement of organized cruelty or premeditated bloodsport. Local newspapers, under pressure from influential families with ties to the plantation owner, print sanitized versions of the event. Any mention of the hidden arena, gladiatorial fights, or systematic abuse is deliberately omitted. The story explores the moral and political pressures that encourage complicity, illustrating how social and economic interests shape the official version of history. The section details the role of survivors, many of whom are hesitant or unable to recount the full horrors. Trauma, fear of retribution, and distrust of authority prevent them from speaking openly. Some are coerced or persuaded to provide testimonies that align with the official narrative, while others simply leave the area, disappearing into anonymity. These silences create gaps in the historical record, allowing the plantation owner's orchestrated cruelty to fade from public memory. The audience is left to grapple with the tension between documented fact and the lived experiences of those who endured the atrocities firsthand. Attention is given to the bureaucratic processes that further obscure the truth. Insurance claims are quietly processed, property disputes arise, and surviving overseers or employees are incentivized to testify in ways that protect influential parties. Documents that might reveal the systematic nature of the forced gladiatorial matches disappear or are altered. The narrative emphasizes how institutional structures, legal, financial, and social, can act to erase evidence, preserving reputations at the expense of justice. The systematic suppression of facts contrasts sharply with the vivid, brutal reality experienced by the enslaved men and intensifies the sense of injustice. The narrative also examines the community's role in shaping collective memory. Neighboring towns, fearful of scandal or economic repercussions, are quick to accept the official story. Folk tales, whispers, and rumors circulate cautiously, often framed as exaggeration or superstition rather than accounts of systemic violence. This tension between silence and storytelling highlights the broader human tendency to minimize uncomfortable truths, allowing atrocities to be glossed over when inconvenient to social cohesion or financial interests. The section creates an eerie sense of moral compromise permeating the post-disaster environment. Scholars, journalists, and historians attempting to reconstruct events face similar challenges. Fragmented testimonies, missing records, and the deliberate destruction of evidence force them to rely on partial observations, archaeological traces, and oral histories. The narrative explores how piecing together the true extent of the plantation's horrors becomes a painstaking process of inference and interpretation. Even decades later, the puzzle remains incomplete, leaving gaps that are filled with speculation, legend, and unresolved questions. The section emphasizes the emotional and psychological dimensions of this erasure. Survivors live with the memories of suffering, yet find that official acknowledgement is minimal or non-existent. Generational trauma persists, creating a silent legacy of fear, anger, and unresolved grief. The audience is invited to feel the weight of this unresolved history, understanding that the violence did not end with the fire but continued to resonate across time through memory, secrecy, and systemic denial. Finally, this section explores the contrast between the visible aftermath, the charred ruins, the scattered remains, the broken land, and the invisible scars left on the human psyche. The official story becomes a means of societal self-preservation, a carefully constructed narrative that shields the broader community from facing complicity in systemic cruelty. This reflection lays the groundwork for the final sections, which examine folklore, memory, and the lingering impact of the plantation's secret gladiatorial system. By the end, the audience understands that the official version of events is not a record of truth but a complex artifact of power, fear, and deliberate historical erasure, leaving the ultimate horror partially hidden yet hauntingly present. This section examines the immediate and long-term response of authorities, the media, and the local community following the catastrophic fire that destroyed the plantation, highlighting the ways in which the truth of the horrors was systematically suppressed. It opens with the arrival of local officials, magistrates, and investigators at dawn, confronted with the smoldering ruins of the plantation. The air is thick with smoke, the ground littered with charred timber, twisted iron, and the remains of the clandestine arena. The scene is chaotic and disorienting. The bodies of enslaved men are partially burned, some missing entirely, while scorched belongings and remnants of fighting gear hint at the brutality that unfolded within the hidden structures. Even at this initial stage, the officials are struck by the magnitude of the destruction, yet the full scale of cruelty is obscured by the chaos and absence of complete documentation. The narrative explores the authorities' immediate decision to frame the fire as a tragic accident. Lanterns, neglected for too long in the barn or arena, are suggested as the likely cause, and the possibility of deliberate sabotage is quietly dismissed. Local newspapers, influenced by plantation owners and wealthy investors connected to the estate, report the event as a misfortune resulting from negligence, avoiding any mention of the secret arena, organized blood sport, or systematic cruelty inflicted upon the enslaved men. The section emphasizes the moral compromises made to protect wealth, reputation, and social stability, demonstrating how power structures shape historical narratives and erase uncomfortable truths. Survivors of the fire are hesitant to recount their experiences fully. Fear, trauma, and the presence of authority figures compel them to offer carefully measured accounts, often downplaying the violence or describing it in terms that align with the official story. Some are pressured directly through threats, bribery, or promises of protection, while others choose silence, disappearing from the region entirely. The section highlights the tension between lived experience and imposed narrative, illustrating how acts of cruelty are further perpetuated through collective silence and coercion. Oral histories, whispered accounts, and fragmented memories remain, but they exist alongside an official record designed to obscure, deny, and sanitize the events. The bureaucracy surrounding the aftermath of the fire is detailed, showing how legal and financial systems conspired to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Insurance claims are quietly settled, damaged property is rebuilt or abandoned, and surviving overseers or employees are incentivized to provide statements that protect influential parties. Plantation records that might have contained evidence of systematic gladiatorial fights are either missing, destroyed, or deliberately altered. This careful suppression of documentation illustrates how institutional mechanisms can shield perpetrators of cruelty while simultaneously erasing evidence of their crimes, leaving historians and investigators to piece together a history that was actively being erased at its source. The section also examines the local community's role in shaping collective memory. Neighbors and townspeople, many of whom had long suspected or witnessed unusual practices at the plantation, quickly conformed to the official narrative. Economic dependence, fear of scandal, or social pressure encourages silence. Folk tales, rumors, and recollections circulate cautiously, reframed as exaggeration or superstition rather than acknowledgement of organized brutality. The narrative emphasizes the psychological and social mechanisms that allow atrocities to be hidden in plain sight, revealing how complicity, denial, and selective memory protect systemic cruelty. Attention is given to the challenges faced by later investigators, historians, and scholars attempting to reconstruct the events. Fragmented testimony, missing records, and deliberately destroyed evidence complicate attempts to uncover the full truth. Archaeological findings provide clues, unusual skeletal injuries, evidence of trauma inconsistent with agricultural labor, and remnants of the hidden arena. Even so, these fragments offer only partial insight, leaving gaps that are often filled with speculation, legend, and folklore. The narrative stresses the difficulty of reconciling empirical evidence with oral histories and survivor accounts, highlighting the limits of historical reconstruction when systems of power actively suppress truth. The section explores the psychological and emotional consequences of the official story on survivors. Trauma is compounded by the erasure of their experiences from public acknowledgement, creating a layered burden of suffering. Generational trauma persists, shaping the descendants of survivors with fear, anger, and unresolved grief. The audience is invited to consider the enduring impact of silenced atrocities, recognizing that the fire, while physically destructive, did not extinguish the psychological imprint of cruelty. Memories linger, haunting both the land and those connected to it, even as official narratives attempt to overwrite them. In addition, the narrative examines the contrast between the physical aftermath of the fire and the ongoing invisibility of the cruelty that caused it. The ruins of the plantation, scorched earth, crumbled buildings, and ash-covered fields, stand as a visible reminder of destruction, yet the deeper truth of systematic human suffering is absent from official accounts. This dichotomy underscores the selective memory of societies, emphasizing how power, wealth, and fear can shape collective understanding while masking reality. The story conveys a profound sense of injustice. The violence of the plantation is both undeniable and simultaneously erased in the public record. Finally, this section reflects on the long-term implications of the official narrative. It sets the stage for the subsequent exploration of folklore, memory, and lingering psychological consequences. The audience is confronted with the dissonance between the sanitized version of events and the probable realities experienced by the enslaved men, creating a sense of unease that persists beyond the immediate story. The section closes by framing the official story not as a neutral account but as a deliberate construction shaped by power, fear, and societal self-preservation, a narrative designed to protect perpetrators while leaving victims' experiences obscured, ensuring that the horrors, though partially hidden, continue to resonate in memory, landscape, and legend. This section explores the long-term legacy of the plantation and the enduring echoes of the atrocities committed within its grounds, blending historical reflection with eerie folklore. Decades after the fire, the land remains scarred and largely abandoned, a quiet testament to the horrors that occurred there. Locals spoke in hushed tones about strange lights flickering at night among the overgrown fields, faint cries carried by the wind, and shadowed figures glimpsed moving across the ruins. The narrative emphasizes how physical destruction cannot erase the emotional and psychological imprint of violence, and how memory and trauma persist in both the landscape and the people connected to it. The story delves into archaeological and historical investigations, highlighting skeletal remains with unusual injuries inconsistent with ordinary plantation labor. Researchers interpret evidence suggesting brutal physical conditioning and ritualized combat, corroborating fragments of oral histories. Even scientific findings are incomplete, leaving room for speculation and myth. The section underscores the tension between documented fact and lingering uncertainty, illustrating how horror survives both in bones and in the collective imagination of the community. The section also examines the way the plantation's dark history infiltrated local folklore. Stories of the hidden arena and the enslaved men who fought for survival became cautionary tales passed quietly through generations. Children were warned not to wander into the fields at night, elders told stories that blurred the lines between historical fact and supernatural embellishment. These narratives reinforced the haunting presence of the plantation in the communal consciousness, creating a cultural memory that persists even as the physical structures decay. The emotional weight of this folklore reflects both fear and reverence, preserving the story of cruelty in symbolic form. Psychologically, the section explores the residual trauma experienced by descendants of survivors and witnesses. Family histories are marked by fear, secrecy, and fragmented recollections of ancestors' suffering. Even those generations removed from the events feel the echoes of what occurred, shaping identity, relationships, and perceptions of safety. The narrative emphasizes how trauma can traverse generations, remaining embedded in memory, behavior, and community perception long after physical evidence is lost. The narrative also addresses attempts at historical reconstruction. Scholars, journalists, and local historians endeavor to piece together events using scattered documents, survivor testimonies, and archaeological findings. Each new discovery adds to the understanding of what occurred but simultaneously raises more questions. Gaps in evidence and contradictory accounts underscore the difficulty of reconstructing a past deliberately concealed by fear, complicity, and societal indifference. The section conveys a sense of meticulous detective work tinged with frustration, illustrating how some truths resist full exposure. Environmental detail is used to reinforce the haunting atmosphere. Overgrown fields, twisted trees, and decaying structures evoke a sense of nature reclaiming the space, while also preserving the memory of violence through the persistence of scars in the earth. The narrative draws parallels between the physical resilience of the land and the psychological endurance of memory. Both bear the imprint of past horrors, silently chronicling events that official records attempted to erase. These descriptions evoke a cinematic sense of lingering dread, immersing the audience in an environment where history and haunting coexist. The section explores specific incidents reported by locals over the years. Travelers recount fleeting glimpses of figures running through the ruins, hearing footsteps in empty corridors, or hearing low, indistinct murmurs that echo across the fields. These occurrences are presented without overt supernatural interpretation, allowing the audience to grapple with whether they are the result of psychological projection, lingering trauma, or the genuine imprint of history upon the landscape. This ambiguity strengthens the emotional tension and reinforces the theme that horror leaves indelible marks, regardless of whether it is consciously remembered or mythologized. Attention is also given to the contrast between silence and storytelling. While official narratives erased the plantation's cruelty, oral histories, folklore, and family stories ensured that memory persisted in private, intimate, and fragmented ways. The narrative explores the power of these unofficial accounts to preserve truth and instill caution, showing that even in the absence of formal acknowledgement, the human mind and community memory act as repositories for experiences that cannot be fully erased. Finally, the section closes with a meditation on legacy and unresolved trauma. The plantation exists simultaneously as a historical site, a cultural memory, and a haunting presence in both land and mind. Descendants, historians, and locals grapple with questions of morality, justice, and remembrance, understanding that the events were deliberately hidden, yet cannot be entirely forgotten. The section leaves the audience with a lingering unease, emphasizing that the atrocities committed on this soil continue to reverberate through time, silently shaping perception, memory, and identity long after the fires were extinguished and the buildings crumbled. The ghosts in the soil serve as both literal and metaphorical reminders that history, even when suppressed, leaves traces that endure, haunting landscapes and minds alike. This final section serves as a reflective and emotionally resonant conclusion, tying together the historical narrative, survivor experiences, and the lingering legacy of the plantation's hidden gladiatorial system. It opens by revisiting the central figure, the plantation owner, whose calculated cruelty created a theater of suffering. Though his physical presence has long vanished, his influence persists in the psychological imprint left on the enslaved men, their descendants, and the local community. The narrative emphasizes the duality of memory, the deliberate erasure of atrocities from official accounts and the enduring, almost spectral, persistence of trauma in oral histories, folklore, and familial recollection. The section examines how the hidden arena functioned not merely as a site of physical combat, but as a symbol of the broader mechanisms of domination, control, and dehumanization. Each duel, each act of forced endurance, was an instrument of terror designed to strip individuals of agency while simultaneously entertaining and impressing a select audience of powerful observers. This deliberate orchestration of suffering creates a chilling portrait of human cruelty, highlighting contrasts between innocence and malice, reason and obsession, and the facade of civility versus the reality of unchecked power. The audience is encouraged to confront the moral implications, recognizing how social hierarchies and economic incentives enabled such atrocities to flourish with minimal oversight. Attention is given to the survivors and their descendants, exploring how trauma reverberates across generations. Memories of the arena, though often fragmented or repressed, shape identity, relationships, and community cohesion. The narrative delves into specific instances of inherited fear, hypervigilance, and a profound sense of injustice that lingers long after the physical horrors have faded. The emotional resonance is heightened through intimate reflections on the costs of survival, the guilt, shame, and resilience that coexist in complex ways. The section emphasizes that while the arena itself is gone, the psychological architecture of terror it created continues to influence lives, shaping perceptions and narratives in ways that are both subtle and profound. The story also explores how historians, researchers, and folklorists attempt to reconstruct the events of the plantation. Fragmentary records, oral testimonies, and archaeological discoveries offer glimpses into the scale of violence, yet the deliberate erasure and obfuscation by authorities make definitive reconstruction impossible. This tension between evidence and uncertainty reinforces the eerie, unresolved quality of the narrative. The audience is invited to grapple with questions of truth, memory, and accountability, understanding that some aspects of history resist closure, no matter how rigorous the investigation. The section emphasizes the symbolic weight of the land itself. Overgrown fields, remnants of the hidden arena, and scars in the earth serve as persistent reminders of past atrocities. Nature, while reclaiming the physical space, cannot erase memory, rather, it preserves traces of violence in subtle ways. These environmental details reinforce the haunting tone, creating a cinematic sense of place where history, trauma, and landscape intertwine. The plantation becomes more than a location, it becomes a living repository of memory, sorrow, and moral reflection. The narrative revisits themes of complicity and moral failure. The community's silence, the authorities' erasure, and the broader social structures that enabled cruelty are examined not only as historical facts but as ethical dilemmas that resonate with contemporary audiences. By reflecting on how systemic oppression was maintained through secrecy, fear, and economic interest, the section draws a broader conclusion about human nature, power, and the consequences of ignoring injustice. The story underscores the responsibility of memory and historical inquiry in confronting uncomfortable truths, even when the full picture remains obscured. Psychologically, the section addresses the interplay between fear, resilience, and moral reckoning. Survivors and observers alike were forced to navigate a world in which cruelty was normalized, authority was absolute, and escape was uncertain. The narrative traces the long-term effects on individual and collective consciousness, exploring how trauma manifests in behavior, relationships, and cultural memory. It emphasizes that while physical survival is measurable, psychological survival is far more complex and enduring, often leaving marks that cannot be erased by time or history books. The section also examines the role of storytelling in preserving truth. Oral histories, folklore, and personal recollections act as repositories for experiences intentionally omitted from official records. The narrative emphasizes the importance of these stories in resisting historical erasure, highlighting how memory, personal, communal, and symbolic, ensures that atrocities are neither forgotten nor repeated. The audience is encouraged to reflect on the power of narrative as both a witness and a moral instrument, capable of preserving truth beyond the reach of systemic suppression. Finally, the section closes with a meditation on the enduring legacy of the plantation and its hidden arena. The story lingers on the duality of remembrance. The fire may have destroyed the physical structures, the authorities may have silenced public acknowledgement, yet memory, trauma, and moral awareness endure. The narrative leaves the audience with a haunting sense of unresolved tension, underscoring that the true horror of the plantation was not only in the acts themselves but in the complicity, silence, and calculated concealment that allowed them to continue unchecked. The arena beneath memory remains, etched into the land, the descendants, and the collective conscience, a persistent testament to human cruelty and the resilience of memory.